good to go? Thank you. I'd like to welcome everyone to the December 16th meeting of the Camino Real Regional Mobility Authority. Call this meeting to order. Mr. Berman, are there any public comments?
No public comments.
Members, if you've had an opportunity to review the minutes of our meeting of November 13th, 2009, are there any additions or corrections? None. Is there a motion to approve the minutes as submitted?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, same sign. Item number 4, discussion and action on the election of CRRMA officers and terms for said offices. Item number A, we've recently had a resignation of one of our board members, Mr. Tanny Berg. I believe he was a founding board member along with a couple of you guys and did yeoman service and is very much appreciated, and he will be very missed. But he also, I believe, last month or the month before was elected secretary of the board.
That's correct.
So we can address that now. What's the board's desire?
Well, I think we need to address it. Was he elected secretary or alternate?
Mr. Berg was elected secretary,
He was elected secretary.
and Mr. Bayan was elected alternate secretary. Now, I've added both in case you wanted to discuss the entire office, but of course, Dr. Bayan is still the alternate secretary.
So, in its current state, Dr. Payan can sign as a secretary. Okay.
That's correct.
We're missing a couple of board members. I mean, there's no...
Ms. Melendez said that she couldn't make it today,
Okay.
but I understood that Mr. Adama will be here.
Okay.
I'd like to table this until next month and talk to some of the other board members and see who's interested in doing that.
Is that a motion?
That's a motion.
For until January?
Until the January meeting.
Is there a second?
Second that.
Any further discussion? None. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, same signs. Tabled until the January board meeting. Item number 5, presentation, discussion, and action on the tax increment project study of the Transportation Investment Zone Number 1, City of El Paso by TXP Incorporated.
Raymond Tejas, Executive Director for the Camino Real RMA. For the record, today we have with us representatives from TXP who have completed the tax increment projection study. As you'll remember, the study was provided to each of you last month, and I mentioned, in fact, it was completed, I believe, a day or so before that meeting. So I presented it to you and noted that we would have them here for a full presentation today. So,
Welcome.
Well, it's good to be here. My name is Travis James. I'm an economist with TXP, and I've met some of you the last time we were out here a few months ago. I have hard copies of this, Raymond. Would people like hard copies of the presentation notes, or are you?
I'd love to see one. Do you have a PowerPoint also?
I do.
Okay, great.
And here, I also have maps. I'm going to go over 2 maps of the TRZ. So
Thanks, Steve.
Thank you.
And before I get going, I'd like to introduce the members of the project team: Rick Mojica and Amparo Ortega with ECM. Charles Heimsath at the end with Capital Market Research. He's the research analyst on the team. And then John Hopkins with TXP as well.
Welcome.
So this will be a 10 to 15 minute presentation. Feel free to jump in, ask questions. Hope this is going to be interactive. I assume all of you have read the study and are familiar with the results, or has at least seen the technical memo that I provided to Raymond a few months ago. So hopefully this isn't new, but I can answer any questions that you have. Here's the outline. It's pretty brief. We'll go over the scope of work, which also closely matches the report itself. I'll go over the 4 study area corridors that we looked at. As you know, there are 8 corridors, or the 8 subsections of the TRZ, and we looked at 4 of those. I'll highlight the key findings by task. I'll discuss the revenue forecast for both the baseline assumption, assuming no new development, as well as appreciation and new development within the 4 corridors that we looked at specifically. I won't go into all of this right now, so I'll go through this as I walk through the presentation, but there were 7 basic tasks that we went over. We spent a lot of time on task number 1, which was getting good baseline information that was important for both you all, for the financial advisor, and for TxDOT to make sure that we properly calculated and determined the baseline values within the TRZ. As I said, we came in a year ago. You had TTI do a study, and the TTI report identified 4 key corridors that would generate the most revenue within the TRZ, and those are the 4 corridors that we focused on as part of our analysis. So 1, 3, part of 4, and part of 6. Let's see if this works. So sections Section 1 is the area between Joe Battle between Montana and I-10. Corridor 3 is Zaragoza Road between Montana and Joe Battle. Subsection of Corridor 6 is the section on Trans Mountain Road between I-10 and the mountains. And Corridor 6 is I-10 Trans Mountain Road to Executive Center. But on this map, you see all 8 of the zones. This is Corridor 1, as I said. It's 5,500 acres. There you see the breakdown in terms of acreage by land use as well as taxable value. So not market value, but taxable value once all exemptions have been removed. Corridor 3, 1,500 acres, $400 million in taxable value in 2008. Corridor 4, 1,000 acres, and what you notice about Corridor 4 is there hasn't been much development or any development. It's only on the tax roll right now for $7.5 million, and we project a lot of growth to take place in this corridor. So it's Trans Mountain Road between the mountains and I-10. Corridor 4 continues over on the other side of the mountains, but we did not look at that area. And then Corridor 6, again, we looked at a subsection, Executive Center all the way north. And some of these corridors overlap a little bit, and we work with city staff to determine how we were going to break this up. So if you look at the top, Corridor 4 and Corridor 6 would run into each other. So we've isolated those for Corridor 6 and then those for Corridor 4 so they don't overlap. So there's not double counting. Parcels are only listed one time. So here's the baseline data for 2008 when you approved, or the city approved, the TIF. 48,000 acres and approximately 58,000 parcels. So that's all 8 of the sections of the corridor. The baseline value in 2008 was $8.2 billion. That represents about 1/3 of the city's tax base and land area. So that's what the TRZ represents. In 2009, we have 1 year's worth of actual data. The TRZ appreciated 4.7%, which translates to about $2 million worth of revenue to the RMA. And 4.7% is a number that we should remember because when I worked on the technical memo for TxDOT, we assumed 3 scenarios, 2% appreciation, 3% appreciation, and 4% appreciation. And I'll go into why we use those. But at least in the first year, appreciation was greater when you add in new development. So the second task was to do our economic and demographic baseline assessment. And the reason that's important is because we need to determine how many people and how many new jobs will be created in the region over the next 30 years, and then translate that into a land use absorption or demand forecast. So the first thing we did, and you notice this in the report, it starts on about page 13, there's about a 10-page overview of El Paso. And I think the thing that stands out from this is that growth over the next 5 years in El Paso will be driven by Fort Bliss. Activity at Fort Bliss, taking the number of soldiers from 21,000 to 45,000 over the next 5 years, will be the major driver of this economy over the next 5 to 10 years. and that's factored into the forecast. How many live on base, how many will live off base, where they would likely live, was taken into consideration. And this is the high-level population, employment, income, and taxable value forecast. If you look at page 30 of your report, you see a detailed forecast by year. These are just the highlights. These are the key points. So the fourth step, and one of the steps that was important because we weren't looking at all of the sections of the TRZ, and important for TxDOT and the financial advisor, is what happens if no new development occurs and we just get appreciation. How much money will the TRZ generate? And we use three scenarios: a low scenario, a medium scenario, and a high scenario. The low scenario is linked to population growth. So over the past 20 years, population growth has been about 2% a year. The average price of a home, according to the federal government, has appreciated 3% a year, and that's a good indicator over the past 24 years. And the high scenario is based on wage and income data. How much money were people making, how much will they have the next year, and what could they afford? Using the city's 2009 tax rate as a constant, 0.633 per $100 valuation, this is the 30-year revenue forecast of the entire TRZ, assuming no new development. We think the TRZ will generate between $600 million and $1.4 billion. Any questions on that, or is everybody clear on how we came up with those numbers? No new development, taking that $8.5 billion value and appreciating it 2%, 3%, or 4%. And so the next task we had was, within these four quarters that we're looking at, how will they develop? And so what we did is we used the term control segment analysis, and Charles can speak to this if you have any questions. But the idea was, instead of forecasting brand new types of real estate product that doesn't exist, or assuming it's going to be 2 or 3 times more expensive than what's on the ground, we identified 5 sections of El Paso where roadway improvements were done, and we looked over time how the land use patterns changed, and we also looked at the average value per acre.
How far back did you look at on some of these roadway improvements and the impact? Was that 20 years, 30 years?
The data from the county, or from the appraisal district, was only 4 or 5 years worth of data. And I can go into that, but 4 or 5 years worth of data. But we look longer, and Charles, you may want to answer this question. We looked at real estate trends over the last 10 to 20 years. So we collected single-family building permits for the last 9 years and plotted those in the GIS system. We looked at data from the Texas A&M Real Estate Center, which went back 20 years. But from appraisal district data, it was 5 years worth of data, 2004 through 2009. So here are the 5 quarters that we looked at. They're a little bit hard to see. I think they're easier to see in your hard copy report.
Can you go back to the Corridor 3 map?
Yes.
This is Saragossa and Loop 375, is that correct?
Montana and Joe Battle on Zaragoza. It overlaps a little bit with 1, and it's hard to, I don't know how to turn the pointer on, Control 2. It's this section right over here. This is 3, and this is 1. And one of the challenges when we looked at when we got the original data, it's a mile off center line in this area over here. I'm sorry, it's hard to see. They overlapped and they were counted twice. So one of the things we did with Matthew McElroy in the planning department and Raymond in the appraisal district was just pick. Is it going to be in 1? Is it going to be in 3? And there's no other, honestly, rhyme or reason why 1 got put in 1 and 1 got put in 3. I think they picked 1 first and then everything else. So that's 1. That's 3. 1,500 acres. And then what we did is we took that high-level county population and employment forecast and we allocated it to the census tract level. There are 180 census tracts? 80 to 100 census tracts that we allocated that to. Then we determined which one of those census tracts were in the study area, and then we allocated the different control segments to a quarter. So, for example, in quarter 4, we may have said in 2030, quarter 4 will look 50% like control segment 1, 20% like control segment 2, and 30% will remain undeveloped. And so we grew development over time, again, using real data, real appraisal values, which we think is an appropriate way to do this. What does that all translate to? So if we look at quarter 1, again, Joe battle between Montana and I-10, 5,500 acres, about 1,400 acres are considered undeveloped. That means vacant lots, ag land, just undeveloped land use classifications. All of that land, about all of it, gets developed by 2040. Oops. There we go. Sorry. Does everybody understand that? So 2008 is where we are today, and then we phased in development over time. So single family, category A, goes from 2,800 acres to 3,700 acres just in quarter 1. Commercial grows from 1,200 acres to 1,500 acres. And so what we did is we appreciated the existing land in the quarter by 2%, and then when we assume land transitioned from undeveloped to developed, we brought it on based on the value of the control segment we were using. So an example would be, let's just say the average value per acre is $500,000. It's higher than that. Let's say it's $500,000. And in control segment 1, it's worth $1 million. We brought in that $1 million per acre and converted the undeveloped to this higher valued acreage, or it may have been less. We did the same thing for each of these. Here's quarter 3, 1,200 undeveloped acres in 2008. All of that gets consumed or used up by 2030. Again, 300 acres are single-family homes. You add 800, 900 acres over time. Commercial goes to 253, and the undeveloped acreage goes down to 0.
And I'm a little confused. This was driven by the population growth and then taking the value of that vacant land and basically taking a look at how vacant land is appreciated as infrastructure has been placed in, and then valuing that infrastructure to come up with these totals, right?
Right. Like I said, we took population employment forecast and allocated it, and we looked at the density. So we said, okay, this area is going to add 1,000 people, which translates into 4 homes per acre, which means you need 250 acres. What's the value of that 250 acres of residential land? It looks like control segment 2, and control segment 2 values that acre at $800,000.
It's more than just the land, it's the land and the built environment.
It's the land and the built environment, plus appreciation over time.
Okay. May I, Mr. Chair? On single family, just so I can understand, obviously it grows from 305 to 1177.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not because of incremental housing, or is that appreciation of the property? Or both?
That's new housing that comes
New
online.
housing units.
So you have 300 acres or 305 acres of housing.
Okay.
Housing units, maybe it's 4 units per acre. Then you build enough new housing to consume another 800 acres.
Mm-hmm.
And that area is actually maxed out because it's really only 1,200 acres
Correct.
total in this particular
Correct.
zone. So that's why it caps off at 2030.
Correct. And so all you get after 2030 is appreciation of the existing development plus all of the new development that happened between 2008 and 2020.
So appreciation isn't calculated.
So it's appreciation and new development.
So there's an assumption then, based on historical numbers, that commercial, industrial will follow the rooftops.
Yes.
Right.
And it's the distribution based on the control segment. So control segment 1 may have been 50% residential and 50% commercial industrial. Another one might have been 20% residential and 80%. And so I blended all of that in to come up with these numbers. The same thing happens in Corridor 4 as we.
Can I go back and ask a quick question? From 2010-6 to 253, I mean, is that in 20 years, 2010 to 2030? Is that, how,
I'm not controlling it. I'm not the person.
there you go.
No, he just wanted to see it up on that. So the question was, we see that much demand between 2010 and 2020 in Corridor 3?
In 20 years, yeah.
Yes. In 10 years, or between 2020 and 2030.
Yeah, yeah. And can you break that down a little bit? I mean, what's behind that? For commercial and industrial specifically?
You want to come stand up here and?
Okay. It sounds like a huge explosion of industrial and commercial.
Well, these four corridors are the high, well, in general, these were the high growth areas of El Paso. And that's why I think TTI also had the same conclusion after they did their analysis, that these four corridors are where you'd see the most growth over the next 30 years. And that's why we identified these four.
I mean, that's percentage-wise, that's huge.
To give you a frame of reference, I'm working in Pearland right now.
Excuse me, could I get you all to come up to the podium?
You're absolutely right. It's a giant.
Would you just mind identifying yourself?
Yes.
Of course. I'm John Hockenhiels with TXP, Charles Himestaff with Capital Market Research. It is a giant percentage increase, but what you're essentially looking at there conceivably is one or perhaps two major projects. I'm working with it, for example, on a project right now that is looking to locate in Pearland, Texas. It's a major manufacturer. They're looking for 350 acres. So one project would account for all of that. Now, I'm not forecasting you're necessarily going to get one big project, but in terms of orders of magnitude, it can easily happen that way. And so it looks like a big percentage increase, and yet, in fact, it could be one big deal.
I'm asking that question because one of the earlier statements was that El Paso is under the state growth, and so I'm like, oh, percentage-wise, that's got to be way above the state growth.
Well,
Well, it's just within this corridor. I think what you see is that growth that takes place right below some other peer communities, you still have a significant amount of growth, and a lot of it is going to take place within these four corridors.
If I might. What we saw when we analyzed the historical growth of population throughout the community, more than half of the census tracts in El Paso County actually lost population between 1990 and 2000, and very few of the tracts are growing at a very rapid rate. And what we're doing is kind of modeling the growth that's occurring around the community, and you've got what I call hotspots, areas that have enormous growth rate, and other areas where it's not growing at all, or in fact might mean maybe losing population. So it seems like a big number in a small area, but that's actually, in our opinion, one of the hotspots in the community, and we see a lot of growth occurring there.
The absolute number to me is less important than the percentage, for example, because that's lots.
Yeah, well, when you start off, you start off on a base of 6, and you go to 253. Yeah, that's a big percent.
Right, but one of the things to bear in mind is all of this is constrained by the overall forecast for population and economic activity in El Paso County, drilled down into the areas that we're analyzing. So that's consistent with the statement that right now El Paso is not growing as rapidly as the state of Texas. This is consistent with that statement.
And this is one of the higher growth areas, I believe, is what you've designated, correct?
Right.
And these numbers are unique to this one particular track only, right?
That's right.
Well, it's to this one area. Not as, we didn't look at specific tracks, but to this area, yes.
Corridor.
Right.
This particular corridor. These are unique to that corridor
Correct.
only. You're not saying the rest of the corridor are going to grow at this same rate, right?
Correct.
Okay.
It looks like this corridor has about 1,400 acres. How does this compare in size to the other corridors? Is this an average size corridor, or is this a smaller size corridor?
It's smaller. If you look, I don't think I have this in the, if you look at page 6 of your report, there's a table, Table 1, that gives you a breakdown. The largest quarter is 1B, and some of this is Fort Bliss picks up some of these, and there's the park and the mountains, but 48,000 acres total. So this is a small fraction of that.
What was the biggest quarter of the 4 that you evaluated, total acres?
Quarter 1B that we evaluated, quarter 1, it's 6,500 acres, but we removed from that all non-taxable property. So if it's owned by a government, it's a park, it's owned by something that gets classified in the appraisal rolls as non-taxable, we assume that wasn't going to be the utility. So 6,500 acres. Quarter 4, we only looked at a small fraction of it, west of the mountains. We looked at 1,000 acres, but quarter 4 is 7,500 acres. Quarter 6, we looked again, that I'll click to now. We looked at 8,700 acres, and quarter 6 is 11,000 acres. So they range roughly 5,000 to 7,000 acres, each of these quarters. To the earlier point, here's quarter 4. You see that there are 973 undeveloped acres in 2008, and the forecast has that going down to 29 undeveloped acres. So 950 acres get developed over the next 30 years. Quarter 6, same approach. Now in this quarter, only 1,300 acres get developed, and this is the quarter where you have the most undeveloped land remaining at the end. So this is I-10 between Executive Center up to Trans Mountain Road. 1,300 acres get developed. And one of the things we looked at using the appraisal district data is we looked at topography. So if there were too many arroyos or there was too much elevation in the property, we tried to adjust the development patterns based on some of those issues.
You don't just fill those in?
Not anymore, I hear.
How about I mean, the unknowns, I think, also are important. Some of them I can think of as, for example, an exodus. The population may leave, or the city may offer incentives and tax breaks to attract industry, so some of the land may be developed, but the tax projection may be less because of incentives, and then I mean, the low cost labor may actually rise in price, and enterprises may go even across the border or somewhere else. Right. What about those unknowns? Are they all factored in some way? Those
were all factored in, and we can speak about those in detail, into that population and employment forecast, the slide that I showed before. So we looked at many variables, including those, when we came up with that long-term population and employment forecast. So how fast you're growing. We looked at specifically what does Fort Bliss do. So when you have these 20,000 new soldiers come in and their family and their dependents, you see, I don't have the details, it's in the report, I believe it's page 19. If you look at chart 19, you see what Fort Bliss will do. And so we took that into consideration. So when you look at the annual population and employment statistics, you see a bump up in population because of those people coming in, and then the growth rate goes back down to the historic average.
Other questions, comments? Very good. Thank you very much. Go ahead.
I don't think he's done yet, right?
I said go ahead.
I can stop. This is it for me. This is the final presentation. I'm good. So there's quarter 6. Okay. I think this is sort of the meat of the presentation right here. This is each of the 4 quarters that we looked at, taking into consideration those land use changes. Here's our forecast for the taxable value of each one of those quarters in those years, both appreciation of existing development and new development. And then obviously when the new development comes in, that appreciates as well. So again, in quarter 1, it's taxed right now at $3 billion. That's the taxable value. That grows to $7.3 billion by 2040. You see quarter 4 where there wasn't a lot of development, $7.5 million, that grows to $1.3 billion. On this table, I subtracted out the 2008 baseline value. You have to remove that initial value. So this is the number, this is the value that the TRZ can use to collect its money or its revenue. And here's what this translates into. Here's a 30-year forecast of tax revenue the TRZ will generate by quarter. So these 4 quarters, again, not all 8, will generate about $1 billion by 2040. $1.1 billion. And if you use a 5% discount rate and you take the net present value, that translates into $362 million.
The corridor, okay, all right.
And these are annual, right?
These are annual numbers and then the total at the bottom. But there's 2 sets of numbers and it gets a little bit confusing. I showed you an earlier set of numbers where I looked at all 8 quarters and I assumed no new development and I appreciated it 2, 3, and 4%. Mm-hmm. This is a refinement. This is both the appreciation and new development for 4 select quarters. So you don't add these 2 numbers together.
At what growth rate?
This is 2%. So working with the financial advisor and some of TxDOT's feedback, we thought using 2% would be appropriate and to be a conservative approach to forecasting revenue. Again, last year it was 4.7%. So the downside is you collect more money or you collect money faster.
This up at the top where it says year, and then it's 1, 2, should that 2 be a 3?
At the very top, the year is going down the column. Those are the quarters.
Those are the quarters.
That's quarter 1. Oh, you're right, quarter 3. Yes, that should be quarter 3 instead of 2.
Okay.
And to an earlier question was asked, we also took into account existing incentives or tax abatements that the city had given as it relates to the 4 quarters that we looked at. There actually weren't that many. There were some Chapter 380s, but there were only a handful of pure property tax abatements. And those that are in place today, when you look at the appraisal rolls, it shows that reduced value for their taxable value. And to be conservative, I never brought those back online at their full value. So if you have a building worth $100 million and your tax abatements for 90%, it's only worth $10 million on the tax roll. When your abatement expires, I don't bring it back on at that higher point. I thought it would just be more appropriate and easier for someone to double check those numbers to just assume it's worth $10 million and appreciates it doesn't come back on at a higher level.
Can you kind of rattle off some of those variables hidden behind the numbers? I mean, really quickly, what are the things?
Behind the tax numbers?
Yeah.
Just 2% appreciation as opposed to using a higher appreciation rate. We don't bring back online any properties that have been given tax abatements that should come back on at a higher point. Those are the only 2 that we haven't talked about. Everything else has been assumed in the population and employment forecast or in identifying the controls that we use.
It's some variables of those 2 or something like that. Yeah.
And Charles, I don't know if you want to talk at all about how we picked the control segments and we looked for projects where there had been comparable roadway infrastructure, and that's probably the other big variable that drives the forecast.
We felt it was important for us to look at growth that had occurred historically within the region in response to or in conjunction with some major roadway improvements, and looked at some areas that had in fact relied substantially on Rick and his team to help us pick areas where there had been roadway improvements and then subsequent development. Joe Battle is an obvious example on the east side, and then we looked at the changes in land use and value that occurred over time, and then we used that as kind of a model to say, okay, that area is going to look a little bit like that area, and just kind of transferred from one part of town to another part of town and said, as it builds out, it's going to look a little bit like this. We didn't really drill down to individual parcels or census tracts, but looked at the larger areas and said that over time the character would change. A couple of things about that is in areas that had substantial floodplains or steep slopes, we netted that out of the available vacant land. So if you had an area that had 1,000 acres, or census tracts that had 1,000 acres, it was growing very rapidly, but 300 acres were non-usable because of the floodplains and steep slopes. When it approached, when the growth got to the point where it ran out of land, we would divert growth to another census tract. And that's how, again, we get these hot spots where you get substantial amount of growth in some isolated areas.
Any particular variables that you discussed and decided that they were not going to be that important for this particular model, and you simply discard it?
Well, that's an interesting question. One of the things we looked at was density of development. In many areas, the development pattern was relatively not very dense. In some areas, we maintained that density. In others, we said, this area is likely to change in its character. We might increase the density. So in other areas, we would say the density, the character of the area would probably stay approximately the same. I can't think of anything that I purposely didn't include.
And I think we didn't assume any kind of mega project, something unusual that something that was going to have a dramatically higher tax base value, a dense urban development.
Or less because of an abatement, tax abatement or something like that. I mean, that's always you can't tell.
Yeah, well, the challenge with the abatement is, as I understand, is no abatement can be given on the property go forward without an agreement because it's part of the TIF.
Oh, okay.
So no abatement could be given on future property
without having to.
Without coming before, I believe, this group. I defer to Raymond on how that process would or wouldn't work. But so we looked at existing abatements, and those are adjusted for in the appraisal roll database. As I said, if you've been given a 50% tax break, your property shows up at only 50% in the net taxable value column. But we assumed no future abatements or anything like that going forward. Nor did we assume the public sector just comes in and buys 500 acres. We assume that the growth that occurs will be private sector development that is taxable, and that the publicly owned property was already subtracted out.
But let me ask you, even given the possibility of tax abatements, of everybody fleeing to Wyoming, whatever the case is, based on your experience and your expertise, this is still a very conservative estimate of value.
Yes.
Okay.
Absolutely. And you have 1 year's worth of data at 4.7% appreciation plus new development. And, we'll know more in 2010. I mean, you'll know in the first couple of years, but that's why we use the 2% appreciation as well.
In 2008, historically, was not exactly a boom year.
Right. I mean, the last couple of years had been higher, and we just said, let's just assume it's an anomaly because of the housing market overall, and let's lower it back down. And as you do your planning, then it puts you in a better position if things come in at 3% or 3.5% as opposed to 5% like it's been.
That's one of the reasons why you take a long period of time and look at the average growth over that, because you have some uptime and you have some downtime, and it washes out. Inevitably, this forecast will not be absolutely accurate year by year, but over an extended period of time, you're going to have some years that are better than we project. You may have some that are a little worse, but you're going to get there one way or the other. Right. And so that's why we take that approach. The other thing that's a little bit different about this approach, and this is actually the second time we've done this, the insight is to say we're going to use real property values in this community in areas that have experienced the same kind of infrastructure improvements that you're talking about making with these funds that you're going to secure through this process. So instead of making an assumption about what might happen based on, gee, wouldn't it be nice if this looked like Austin or this looked like Dallas or whatever? No, these control segment approach that was developed says we're going to rely on real El Paso stuff. When you improve the roadway, here's what happened. And then constraining all of that by the overall forecast for the economy, the overall demographic forecast, which, believe me, took account of a lot of different moving parts when you get right down to it. We think this is, again, the second time we've done this. We think we did it originally down in Hidalgo County, and we find this to be, I think, a very realistic approach that can give some comfort to people who are making financial decisions around all of this, and helping them obviously feel like the market analysis really does support what's realistic and what therefore can be financed.
I like, Mr. Chairman, the fact that we go conservative on the numbers, because it's better to be pleasantly surprised. But I also want to understand, the variables that you're playing around with behind the model and see what's going on. I think
that the big thing that'll change is someone comes in that has, 100 acres or 200 acres and wants to do something special that you don't have here.
Right.
But that'll probably surprise you to the upside.
Right.
Okay.
So that's the presentation. Those are the numbers.
Excellent.
When can we spend the $1 billion? No?
You can start now.
I got somebody to loan it to you.
Sometime in the next 40
If you need more consulting work.
Okay, Raymond, could you just kind of refresh the board on the purpose of this study and why we're doing this? And
Absolutely. The point of the study actually has changed over time, but really the point of the study to date is to use as justification for the State Infrastructure Bank loan that the RMA has pursued, and in fact that you'll see later on in this agenda. So the report, once it was completed, was provided to TxDOT. There was some back and forth from the consultants with TxDOT, including our financial advisor, and we've arrived at terms which I will outline under item number 7. So the study was very useful, and I thank TXP for their good work.
yes, thank you very much. Of course, we did have to pay them to do it, So.
Unfortunately. I understand our next one's free, though.
Okay, is there any other questions, discussion on item number 5? If none, we'll move to item number 6, discussion and action on a board resolution authorizing the executive director to execute a pass-through toll agreement with the Texas Department of Transportation regarding the I-10 at Loop 375 America's Interchange and I-10 corridor aesthetics projects. Mr. Tejas.
As you all know, there are several funding pots for the Americas Interchange project. One of those includes the pass-through toll program of TxDOT. At last month's TTC agenda, the Texas Transportation Commission gave final approval for TxDOT to enter into an agreement with the Camino Real RMA related to the pass-through toll agreement. We're currently waiting on a draft from TxDOT, and we'll negotiate that once we get that draft. But the terms that were agreed to include the following. The pass-through toll agreement will include a total of $10 million worth of reimbursement from TxDOT to the RMA. $5 million of that will go to the Americas Interchange project, and the other $5 million will go to the aesthetics project along the I-10 corridor. The reimbursement rate per vehicle is 5.5 cents. The minimum payments from TxDOT to the RMA is set at $2 million, and the maximum is set at $3 million per year. So those are the terms that were negotiated and that were agreed to by the TTC at last month's agenda. And I've mentioned this to you before. I don't normally like to do this, but what I'm asking of the board here in item number 6 is for the authorization to execute the agreement once the agreement is actually drafted. And the reason that I'm asking for that is, of course, normally I bring you the full agreement as it's been negotiated between the staff of TxDOT and the RMA. But unfortunately, in this circumstance, we really don't have the time. In order to obligate the federal funds, including the stimulus funds, several steps have to be taken, and one of those steps is to present the Federal Highway Administration with a signed pass-through toll agreement. So what I'm asking is for the authorization, and included in the backup is a resolution which explicitly notes the authorization that I'm asking of you. But I'm asking that you grant me the authorization to execute the pass-through toll agreement with TxDOT related to the Americas Interchange and I-10 corridor aesthetic projects. And I've noted in there, incidentally, that I will not have, that authority is contingent upon the review and approval of our outside counsel. So we have that. Yes, sir.
I'll make a motion, and to have a second, I have a question, but I'll
Yes,
make
sir.
a motion to grant you that authority.
Your second?
I'll second that, but I also have a question.
Yeah. Just one quick
Discussion?
question. Yeah. Raymond?
Yes, sir.
I don't mind doing it, but are these terms already set? And the 10 million and the 5.5 cents reimbursement, those are already done?
Yes, sir. And that's what was,
You ever negotiated with Amadeo Signs?
No. That's what I'm asking.
the negotiation is an offer, essentially.
So really this is already said, it's just a matter of authority to do it when it happens, to not have to come back to us.
Well, actually, there is a good deal, or by past practice, there has been a good deal of movement between the attorneys on the language that fills out these terms.
Right.
So there will be some,
Language is okay, but I mean, they're not.
These
gonna
are the
come back
terms.
4.5 cents.
no, sir, these are the
These are
terms.
set in stone.
Yes, sir.
That's what we count. Okay.
And I think it's important to note, these terms have gotten better for us. Originally, they were set, for example, the maximum was set at $2 million per year, which then spread out the repayment term to 10 years. Whereas here, we've got a minimum of 2 years. So we're doing better. And
That's what I'm asking. These are good terms. I like them. I just want to see they're already set.
Yes, sir.
It's a matter of tweaking the
Yes, sir.
verbiage, right?
Yes, sir.
Just for historical memory, this pass-through toll agreement, how does it compare the 5.5 cents, let's say with the Spurs 601 or something like that? I mean, is there a lesson taken in from that previous project, or?
Not really. What drives that is really the vehicle counts and TxDOT's ability to make those payments to you. So, for example, with the Spur, and the Spur is unique in that it has two different billing rates as well, one for trucks and one for cars. So with the Spur, now of course now I've gone blank on the numbers, but we're somewhere around
It's 20 cents.
25 cents for vehicles and like 84 cents for trucks, something like that.
So
You remember, Eduardo? Yeah.
So why 5.5? I mean, I don't really know, but
Again, it's
The
based
drop
on the
in-
vehicle counts because the vehicle counts are significantly higher at this intersection. So whereas and remember too, along the Spur you have various counting points. So every time they hit that counting point, you get either 25 cents or 84 cents. Whereas with this interchange, with this project, every time they hit the one counting station, then you get the 5.5 cents.
Okay.
So it all depends on the vehicle counts for that specific area.
I
That
was just trying to understand, because I did remember much higher numbers at the Spurs 601, and I was thinking, okay, well, there's got to be some formula, some sort of.
And part of it too, if you remember, that pass-through was a significant number. Here, we're only looking for $10 million.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
It appears that you anticipate to executing this agreement fairly quickly.
I hope so, yes.
When do you anticipate? Before the end of the year?
That's the goal. That certainly is the goal. Again, we haven't gotten the draft yet from TxDOT, so we're waiting on that, but I'm hopeful that we can turn it around very quickly. Because, again, these are the terms, so hopefully we can just breeze through some of the language.
So if it's not executed prior to the next board meeting, it's something that we could kind of review the status of.
Oh, if it's not, absolutely, then I'll bring you the final at the next. And in fact, either way, I'm going to bring you the final at next month so I can go through the terms, show you the agreement, and see exactly what you gave me authorization to sign. So you'll see that next month.
Any other questions? Okay, we have a motion and a second. If there's no further discussion, all those in favor of item number 6, say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, same sign. Motion carries. Item number 7, discussion and action on the board resolution authorizing the executive director to execute a loan agreement regarding a loan in the amount of $35 million from the State Infrastructure Bank regarding the I-10 at Loop 375 America's Interchange and the I-10 Corridor Aesthetic Projects. Mr. Tejas, get that little $10 million one out of the way and come back for a $35 million one, huh?
That's right. And unfortunately, I'm asking for the same authorization from the board. As I mentioned, there are a number of agreements that have to be signed and provided to Federal Highways prior to the obligation of the federal funds for the Americas project. And this State Infrastructure Bank loan agreement is one of those requirements. So again, I'm asking you for authorization to execute this agreement. Now, this one's a little bit different in that this has not yet gone back to the Texas Transportation Commission for final approval, but it's scheduled for tomorrow. So I'll be in Austin for tomorrow's Texas Transportation Commission meeting asking for final approval of this. The terms that have been provided to us from the State Infrastructure Bank are as follows. Again, we're looking for a $35 million loan this time. That includes $30 million that would go towards the Americas interchange and $5 million towards the aesthetics corridor project along I-10. The interest rate on this loan is 6%. It's a 30-year repayment term, but we also were able the State Infrastructure Bank is allowing us to take 2 separate draws if we so desire. And also a really big point for us is that they've agreed to defer the interest and principal for the first 2 years from the initial draw. So our financial advisor has reviewed these terms and is comfortable with them and believes, in fact, that they are good terms for what we're asking. This is $35 million that, as I mentioned before, the TRZ study that we discussed earlier, that was essentially the justification for this loan, and we will actually be back to the State Infrastructure Bank for an additional $35 million, likely, hopefully next year, for the remaining 2 comprehensive mobility plan projects, which are the Zaragoza interchange, the Zaragoza direct connectors, and the Northeast Main Lanes project. So we'll be back for the remaining $35 million, hopefully sometime next year.
Raymond, if you could, based on these 2 numbers, I mean, I think we've seen we've got stimulus money. Can you break down now what the dollars are for this project and where they're coming from?
Yes, sir.
I know I'm catching you a little offhand, but I mean, the numbers are still fairly simple.
They are, and I do better when I write them down, so let me jot them down real quick. Make sure they add up, actually. Okay, here we go. The Americas project is a $146 million project. $96 million of that is coming from the stimulus. $30 million will come from the State Infrastructure Bank, which is this loan that we're discussing right now. $5 million will come through the pass-through program, which we discussed as a prior agenda item, and $15 million will come from the Coordinated Border Infrastructure Fund, which are also federal funds. So that should equal $146 million.
I believe it does.
Now, can I ask a question, Raymond? The aesthetic projects for the I-10 corridor, which I had asked you about before, are 10 million, not 5.
That's right.
5 coming from somewhere else, and then these 5 are being tacked to this particular loan, right?
Well, actually, and 5 come from the pass-through program that you just granted authority, and 5 come from the State Infrastructure Bank, which are repaid through the TRZ generated revenues.
Have the federal funds, the American Reinvestment Act, already been obligated to this program, or we're still working on that?
That's what we're working
why
on.
we're needing him to
So this has to be
decide.
completed first before we can finish those funds. Is that?
That's exactly right, and that's why I'm coming to you without the agreements, asking for the ability to sign them, because once I sign them and they're final executed agreements, we provide those documents to the Federal Highway Administration, and then they obligate. They have a couple of other boxes they'll have to check, but these are significant ones.
And this money, I'm assuming, is tied to us getting that money as well. It's a part of the total agreement.
Yes, sir.
Ticky, no laundry.
Got it?
I mean, I'll be happy to support this particular loan and all that, but I will raise the same concern I raised some time ago, which is the $10 million for the beautification project. I'm concerned about that, but I'm not going to jeopardize the entire package for $5 million. But at this stage, I have some concern about that. But okay, just for the record.
So noted.
I make a motion that we authorize the executive director to execute a loan agreement regarding a loan in the amount of $35 million from the State Infrastructure Bank regarding the I-10 at Loop 375 America's Interchange and I-10 Corridor Aesthetics Project.
I second it.
Just cut you out, huh?
Got there.
Any further discussion?
I just have a question for David. 6% sounds fairly good to you. Is that reasonable?
In this market?
Mm-hmm. I mean, you're the accountant. You're
Right, but you're not, you don't generally compare it to normal market loans because it's a huge amount of money. and it's a government project. So, but yeah,
Okay.
absolutely.
All right.
You could probably do better than that on a home mortgage, I think, can't you?
I did.
Maybe.
I did, so,
But we're not buying a home. So.
okay, so, yeah, so, all right,
The answer to your question is it's excellent financing.
all right.
It's
That's what I want to know.
absolutely excellent.
And I have to go to the experts because you guys know that, so,
Well, when you consider that, I believe these are based on repayment of a SIB loan through a TRZ that we have a study on, but no continuous track record on. So I think 6% is probably a pretty good deal.
yeah, it's a premium, it's a little risk there.
Along with no
Wouldn't y'all say?
repayment for 2 years.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, no further discussion? All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, same sign. Motion carries. Item number 8, discussion and action on a board resolution authorizing the executive director, here we go again, to execute work authorization number 4 with PBS&J in regard to the completion of the procurement process for the I-10 at Loop 375 America's Interchange Project. Mr. Tejas.
Now, this one, you'll note we have the agreement in the backup, so you'll know exactly what you're authorizing me to sign.
Thank you.
As by way of background, as you know, the RMA has brought on PBS&J as its general engineering consultant. The way that we've structured that underlying agreement, each time that we want to bring them on to do a specific project, we bring them on through a work authorization. So we've got, to date, 3 separate work authorizations that deal with different projects. The first work authorization is the one that they do the most work on, and that really is the one that looks at the 3 comprehensive mobility plan projects, namely the Americas interchange, the Zaragoza direct connectors, and the Northeast main lanes. We came back and amended that first work authorization some time ago to broaden the scope so that they could focus more on the Americas interchange so that they could develop the procurement process for that project. And in fact, through that amendment, we've given them the authority to develop the Americas project all the way from the beginning out through the obligation of federal funds. So as we're discussing here, we're anticipating the obligation of federal funds here very soon. So what we're doing here with work authorization number 4 is being a little proactive and executing an agreement that allows them to complete the rest of the work from I'm sorry, let me back up. Work authorization number 1 gets us through, yes, that's correct, through the, I'm sorry. Work authorization number 1 gets us through the obligation of federal funds. Work authorization number 4 gets us from the obligation of federal funds up until the selection and execution of an agreement with the developer for the Americas project. So in other words, work authorization number 4 focuses on the completion of the procurement process. So once the RMA board executes an agreement with the selected developer, we'll enter into a new work authorization at that time. So this is really a continuation of the work.
Mm-hmm.
And all these rates have already been negotiated, they're setting, there's nothing.
That's correct. So really, the work authorization focuses on scope and the amount.
Questions, comments? Not, is there a motion to approve number 8?
I'll move.
Is there a second?
Second.
Any further discussion? None? All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, same sign. Motion carries. Item number 9, discussion and action on the adoption of the following CRRMA policies, A, B, C, and D. Raymond, let you take it from there.
Okay. So, item 9A, the ethics and compliance policy. This is a recent requirement that comes into play January 1. It's a recent statutory requirement that was put into place by the legislature. And also, it's a requirement for future TxDOT funding that all RMAs, in fact, all entities that seek funding from TxDOT have to have in place an ethics and compliance policy. So what our outside general counsel did, in fact, it's very useful in that our outside counsel serves also most of the other RMAs in the state. So what they did was they developed one template for the ethics and compliance policies for the RMAs, and then refined it for us. So what you see attached, and in fact you'll see a resolution was passed out as well, the board resolution that adopts the policy. Attached as 9A is the actual policy. As a reminder, there's a very close relationship between this RMA and the City of El Paso. So a lot of the policies that you'll see being adopted are actually City of El Paso policies. So subject to your questions, I would ask that you approve the board resolution that adopts the ethics and compliance policy.
Mr. Chair, I have a question. Mr. Tejas, I was just curious. I think these policies are great, and I think it's terrific that we're adopting them. But in the language, I've noticed that it says employees of the CRRMA and/or employees of the city who are assigned to spend more than 20 hours per week. This policy applies to them, but so basically, if I'm trying to understand why the distinction of more than 20 hours a week. It seems like anybody that's working on behalf of the CRRMA or working for the CRRMA would be under this policy.
Well, and I had several discussions with our attorneys on that one. For example, Steve Berman provides significant work for us, but not to the level of 20 hours per week. So there are certain requirements in here and certain abilities of the RMA and the board to take disciplinary action that we didn't feel was appropriate. For example, with someone like Steve, whose full-time employment is the City of El Paso. So that's why we carved them out.
Would anybody that's working for us less than 20 hours also 100% of the time be a city employee?
There is that possibility. The relationship, and that's why I spoke a little bit to the close relationship between the RMA and the city. We have a management agreement between the two entities that allows for us to bring on employees of the city. Now, in those instances, say, for example, if we actually wanted somebody to come on full-time, then we would have them subject to these. So the answer is yes, ultimately.
Really, well, it's really anybody working over 20 hours a week, basically, whether they're working for the city or not, is kind of bound by this. I was just curious. If you're comfortable with it, I'm perfectly fine. I just thought it was a tad unusual.
It is very unusual, but again, there are no other RMAs in the state that have a relationship quite like ours. So we had to tailor it to fit the situation.
Who's the enforcer? Are you going to?
Yes, sir. There are requirements for notice of anyone that finds out about any violations or that sort of thing. But ultimately, it comes through me, and then the board would.
Is there going to be some sort of training on that?
There will be. We'll develop some training.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, because for example, at UTEP, every year we have to take a training session online.
Well, now remember,
it's mandatory, and so just to make sure.
Well, remember too, currently we don't have any employees, so we're doing this as a statutory requirement. But over the next year, I imagine that we will be looking at employees. So there will be some sort of training. I'm certain that it won't be as extensive as UTEP, but there will be some training.
Right. How does this relate to the Texas Ethics Commission report that we have to file every? April, I think? April? It's separate, completely separate.
It's separate. Now, remember, too, though, that this ethics compliance is for employees. Now, there's a provision in here that says the board should be aware and should make notice of any violations, but it actually is for the employees.
It's not for us, Tony.
Right.
The bottom line is this is mandated by January 1.
Yes, sir.
Now, anybody that would not like to approve this, I'll appoint you to the committee to come up with one between now and January 1.
I have a question for Mr. Tejas. Is there anything in this policy or compliance manual that is in conflict with what the CRRMA already has in its own compliance or ethics?
No, sir.
Okay.
No, sir. There's nothing in here that caused either I or our attorneys any concern whatsoever.
Okay.
All right.
Any other discussion? Not, is there a motion to approve item A?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Any further discussion? Not, all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, same sign. Item 9A is approved. 9B, fiscal year 2010 investment policy.
Now, those of you who have been on the board for more than a year will recognize this. As a reminder, the City of El Paso is the fiscal agent for the RMA. So essentially what we do, and the adoption of an investment policy is another statutory requirement, and we've done that each year that we've been in existence. What we do, though, is simply adopt the City of El Paso's investment policy because, again, they are our our fiscal agent, so they handle all of these transactions for us. What we do that is a little bit different, though, is if you'll notice in the board resolution for this item, we make specific reference to guaranteed investment contracts, or GICs, which are used by the RMA in the State Spur 601 project, and make certain other minor revisions to fit the needs of the RMA. However, this is fairly straightforward and subject to your questions. This one, I would ask for approval of the board resolution.
Raymond, it's been vetted by our attorneys and our advisors and our counselors.
Yes, sir. In fact, the board resolution was developed by our bond counsel.
Motion to approve.
Second.
It's been a motion and a second. Any discussion? None. All those in favor of item 9B, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, same sign. Motion carries. Item number 9, we did this one for Ralph, the drug and alcohol policy.
This is also a statutory requirement.
I was just kidding, by the way.
For the record. This is statutorily required. Again, this had not been adopted because we don't have any employees. However, while we were reviewing the other policies, we realized that we hadn't adopted this one, and we figured that we should adopt it. And so, subject to your review and any questions, I would ask for approval of the board resolution.
So move.
Is there a second?
Second.
Any discussion?
Well, I have a question.
Yeah. About me?
No. No.
No, not as long as you're not an employee.
The way this is written, it doesn't prohibit an employee from working for the CRRMA as long as they're not currently under the influence of a controlled substance or alcohol. But on their own personal time, they can.
Well, there is a provision that notes that the RMA does not, and I forget the language, does not condone, I believe. But this policy is limited to during the RMA's work hours.
Okay. That's it. Thank you.
And the testing is in case an employee is suspect.
Well, actually, the testing is voluntary, and it's at the employees at their request.
But we pay for it, right?
Yes, sir. If, for example, we have reason to believe that an employee was under the influence while they were driving a vehicle on RMA time, we would pursue an investigation, and they would have the ability to take a test and use that as rebuttal evidence.
Okay.
Entertain a motion.
I think we already have a motion in a second.
Yeah, we do.
Yes.
Okay. No, any other discussion? None. All those in favor of item 9C, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, same sign. Motion carries. Item number 9D, records retention.
Again, this was a policy that was, we realized had not yet been adopted. This is the policy that governs how the RMA deals with its records and when it can dispose of certain records. And again, I should have mentioned this along with the drug and alcohol policy, but similar to the ethics and compliance policy, these policies are essentially universal that are used by all of the RMAs throughout the state. Our attorney provided the form for them. So this is essentially what the rest of the RMAs are using throughout the state. So, subject to your questions, I would ask for approval of the board resolution.
Is there a motion?
So moved. I do have a question.
Seconded.
You
Any
address
discussion?
Yes, sir. You address emails, right?
Yes, sir.
How about text?
I believe they're covered under electronic correspondence, I believe.
But is it from a personal phone, or is it a phone assigned by the RMA?
Well,
If it's a official business on city, since we use city equipment,
Yeah.
then it would be considered an RMA record.
But if it's your personal phone communicating something relating to the RMA, but from a particular or a private phone to private phone,
My
through
understanding,
text, of course.
my understanding under the public information, you know what, before I say that, let me remind myself that I'm not your attorney, but I can certainly find out.
Okay.
And let me get back to you on that.
All right.
Let me get back to you on that.
I mean, it's getting really complicated because these technologies are coalescing, you know. Okay.
I just don't want you to get busted, Tony.
Yes, exactly.
Really, all we have to remember is if we don't do anything wrong, we don't have to
That's right.
worry about it. Okay, I think we got item number 10.
So we need a vote on that.
Sorry,
9D.
any further discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Those opposed? Motion carries. Item number 10, discussion and action on the Executive Director's Report.
I'll be very brief. We've got two items. As I've discussed with you in the past, the City Council moved all of their Legislative Review Committee meetings to Thursdays. And as you will remember, the RMA had scheduled all of their meetings for the third Thursday of each month throughout the year. So we've got that conflict, and as you can tell over the last few months, we've been bumped from the council chambers. And just for the record, the reason why we meet here is that these meetings are streamed live onto the internet. They're also recorded and saved and are accessible on our website. And so it's important that we continue to meet here. So I'm looking for consensus from the board on the meeting schedule for 2010. Now, I've checked with the city clerk, and they have available for 2010 virtually any time on Fridays of 2010, as well as the first and third Mondays of each month of 2010. Now, we have a couple of options. If you'd like to do either of those, we can set that, and that would be our regularly scheduled meeting anytime on those dates. Or we could continue as we're doing now, and we can discuss it at the end of each meeting as to when the next meeting will take place. So it's up to you. The problem that we've got is that, of course, Tuesday is out because of council meetings. Thursday is out because of their legislative review meetings. Wednesday is essentially booked most of the year for various ongoing meetings. Mondays, we have that flexibility for the first and third Mondays, and then Fridays are usually fairly open.
Mr. Chair, I'd like to, if it's possible, to have a kind of a regular set date, if that works for everybody, as opposed to kind of switching the date around. So I'm really open to pretty much anything, as long as it's set, if it be Friday afternoons or whatever the case may be. So
We only meet once a month, right?
Right.
Yes, sir.
So those Mondays might also work, right? If it doesn't matter whether it's the first or the third
Fridays
Monday.
are easier.
Pardon?
Fridays are easier.
And my understanding, too, is that any time on those Fridays would work. So if you wanted to do a Friday morning or even a Monday morning.
Tony, what about your schedule?
Well, I actually just so happens that I'm teaching on Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays. So Mondays and Fridays work very well for me this year.
Okay. Scott, Mondays or Fridays makes no difference to
I'll
you?
make myself available. Yes, sir.
Do you prefer Fridays?
I prefer Friday. I can come on Monday.
Morning or afternoon?
Friday, anytime. Monday would be afternoon.
Prefer Monday, but Friday mornings for me.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Friday morning ever?
9 a.m.
Okay. How about 10?
And
It'll work.
10 a.m. Which Friday are we
the
going to
third? The third would work, I guess.
That works. Currently, you're scheduled for the third Thursday, and that works well with the MPO meetings and the TTC meetings. If you'd like to schedule Fridays, the third Fridays of each month at 10 a.m.
And then with the flexibility that if there's no quorum, we can move it around a little bit.
Of course, and if we have conflicts, of course, we can. The chair has the ability to move it, or if something comes up, we can have special meetings in between.
Sounds good.
So I'd ask for.
The 15th of January is our next board meeting?
Is that right? Sounds right. Yes. If that's all right, then the third Friday of each month at 10 a.m., and I would ask for a motion on that.
So move.
Is there a second?
Second.
Any further discussion? None. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, same sign. Motion carries.
No,
Mr. Tess?
The last item is just an informational item. Each year, the Texas Department of Transportation holds what they call the Texas Transportation Forum, and it's really a conference, an annual conference of all the transportation leaders in the state. I went last year with the chair, and this year is scheduled for January 7th and 8th, and Mr. Hahn and Mr. Adame will be joining me as well. So we'll, at the next meeting, we'll provide a brief update as to the speakers and the events and how it went. So that's more informational than anything. So with that, I don't have anything else.
Very good. It's the last item on the agenda. Is there a motion to adjourn?
Seconded.
All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, same sign. We're adjourned.